An active investigation led by the FBI after yet another attack on federal agents involved in immigration enforcement. The attacker opened fire early this morning outside a Border Patrol annex in McAllen in what Fox is told was clearly a planned ambush. Border Patrol agents and local police returned fire, hitting and killing the shooter, who was armed.
What happens when a federal detention center, a place designed for order oversight and national security, suddenly becomes the target of a military-style ambush on America's Independence Day? And what does it reveal about the growing willingness of extremist groups to strike at the heart of U.S. authority while much of the nation watches fireworks overhead? On the outskirts of Alvarado, Texas, the night of July 4th unfolded with the usual colors streaking across the sky. But beneath the glow of celebration, Prairieland Detention Center plunged into its most dangerous moment in years. According to early law enforcement reporting and security footage, shadows moved just beyond the northern fence line, fast, deliberate, coordinated. No chants, no banners, no slogans, just a group of masked figures in black paramilitary-style clothing slipping through darkness with the discipline of a trained unit. Their timing was no accident, their silence was intentional, their objective was unmistakably hostile. The first projectile slammed into the outer fencing before officers could fully register what they were seeing. It wasn't a firework drifting off course from a nearby celebration. It was a horizontal launch designed to shock, disorient, and force ICE personnel out of secure positions. In an instant, routine night operations shifted into high alert protocol. Officers secured unarmed staff, locked internal doors, and attempted to assess the scale of the threat. The attack, as later confirmed by investigators, was not spontaneous. It was coordinated with precision. Moments later, the attackers split into smaller teams, breaking toward the parking area. Under the dim halo of facility lighting, they spray-painted ICE vehicles and guard posts with phrases such as "ICE Pig F," "You pigs," and "traitor" messages meant not only to vandalize, but to provoke a tactical misstep. The graffiti triggered an immediate 911 call, drawing local law enforcement into what appeared to be a carefully prepared kill zone. When the first Alvarado police officer arrived, he barely stepped from his vehicle before a muzzle flash erupted from the tree line. A single AR-style round tore into his neck. It was a calculated shot fired from concealment intended to neutralize the first responder and create immediate chaos. Within seconds, a second attacker opened fire from across the road, unleashing 20 to 30 rounds toward unarmed correctional officers who had moved outside after hearing the commotion. Bullets struck pavement vehicles and the structural perimeter. The attackers were not improvising, they were executing a plan. CCTV footage captured the assault from both angles, revealing a coordinated attempt to overwhelm the facility before ICE could organize a defense. It was a tactical ambush bearing the hallmarks of extremist influence, increasingly noted by federal intelligence agencies and referenced in recent assessments highlighted by Reuters and BBC. Small ideologically driven cells acting with higher operational discipline than previous protest-aligned groups. Combined with rising threats against ICE and DHS personnel over the past year, the attack reflected a shift from symbolic disruption to lethal intent. As the first chaotic minutes unfolded, ICE officers inside Prairieland imposed strict lockdown measures. They resisted the instinct to rush into open ground precisely where the attackers wanted them to avoid becoming targets in a crossfire. Instead, they secured hallways, locked vulnerable rooms, and consolidated personnel behind reinforced structures. Their response preserved the integrity of the facility and prevented what could have rapidly spiraled into a mass casualty event. Meanwhile, the attackers continued to maneuver, likely realizing their ambush had failed to draw ICE into an exposed counterattack. Their movement suggested a fallback plan: scatter, retreat to wooded cover, and escape to waiting vehicles before reinforcements arrived. The discipline ICE maintained in those opening minutes proved decisive, setting the stage for the broader multi-agency pursuit that would unfold across Johnson County. But as America reevaluates this July 4th ambush, one question rises above all: if extremist cells are now adopting battlefield tactics against federal officers inside the United States, how many more groups are preparing to test the limits of national security, and how should the country respond before the next attack breaks the silence? What does it mean when the first bullet in a coordinated assault is aimed not at ICE officers, but at a local police responder, someone arriving to help? And what kind of group choreographed simultaneous gunfire from two directions with the precision of a paramilitary strike against unarmed federal personnel? As the Prairieland attackers moved deeper into their plan, their next phase unfolded with chilling clarity. After defacing government vehicles and guard posts, their graffiti served its purpose. It pulled a local officer into the open. The moment the patrol car rolled to a stop, a shot cracked from the woods. One round, one flash, one strike to the neck. Surveillance and body cam footage later confirmed the shot was not random. It was calculated, fired from concealment, and intended to neutralize a first responder before reinforcements multiplied. Almost immediately, a second shooter positioned across the road unleashed a violent barrage, firing 20 to 30 rounds toward ICE correctional officers who had stepped outside after hearing the commotion. Bullets shattered the quiet night, pinging off vehicles, biting into pavement, and punching into the outer walls of the detention center. The attackers demonstrated two realities federal analysts from Reuters, DW, and The Guardian have noted throughout 2024-2025, extremist groups in the US are increasingly embracing military-style tactics, and they no longer hesitate to target law enforcement officers with lethal force. The nature of the assault showed disciplined, coordinated timing, overlapping fire positions, and immediate retreat vectors. These were not protesters. They were not agitators. They were a cell executing a multi-stage ambush. ICE officers, many of whom had responded instinctively to protect unarmed staff, were suddenly pinned behind barriers, aware that any movement toward open ground could be fatal. Inside the facility, alarms blared. Officers scrambled to secure internal corridors and move civilian staff behind reinforced structures. They understood the attackers were attempting to lure personnel outside into the kill zone between the parking lot and the outer road. By refusing to take that bait, ICE prevented what could have been catastrophic casualties. Meanwhile, the attackers continued firing in controlled bursts, creating noise chaos and confusion. According to later forensic analysis, their ammunition types, firing angles, and positions suggested familiarity with paramilitary operations. Some wore tactical vests, some carried radios. One carried a Faraday bag, large enough to block phone signals, an item not associated with casual vandalism, but with operations designed to evade tracking and digital surveillance. As the shooting intensified, the attackers executed their exit, scatter, evade, and attempt to disappear into the surrounding woods and waiting vehicles. The level of planning mirrored trends highlighted by Homeland Security analysts, small extremist networks using decentralized coordination, ideological propaganda, and guerrilla-style tactics to test federal response times. By the time ICE tactical personnel emerged in protective gear, ready to defend the perimeter if it were breached, the shooters were already dispersing. Their plan had failed to trigger a full collapse of the facility's defenses. Instead, they found themselves racing against the clock as local, state, and federal law enforcement units converged on the area. But even as they fled, one truth became clear: these individuals were not improvising. They were acting with intent, lethal, ideological, and increasingly bold. And if extremists are now willing to deploy overlapping fire lines against federal officers, the nation faces a critical question. How prepared is America for the next coordinated assault carried out not abroad, but within its own borders? What stops a coordinated extremist ambush from turning into a mass casualty attack on US soil? And how does a federal agency, often politically targeted, frequently criticized, and increasingly assaulted, maintain discipline under fire when chaos is the attacker's primary weapon? Inside Prairieland Detention Center, the moment the first gunfire erupted, ICE officers executed what investigators later described as a textbook emergency lockdown. While the attackers attempted to provoke a reactive chase into open terrain, ICE personnel instead shifted immediately to fortified positions, refusing to abandon the tactical high ground the facility provided. According to DHS incident reporting and early media analyses referenced by BBC and Reuters, this measured response became the defining factor preventing further casualties. Internal doors were sealed. Civilian staff were evacuated into hardened rooms designed for crisis containment. Communication channels opened simultaneously with local police, Johnson County authorities, and federal partners. Instead of rushing outward into darkness and gunfire, officers held their ground, understanding that discipline, not aggression, was the only way to survive a coordinated ambush. Inside the compound, the soundscape of the facility transformed. Shouting gave way to controlled instructions. Boots moved quickly but methodically across polished concrete floors. Radios buzzed with status updates. Officers donned ballistic gear, reinforced defensive positions, and prepared for the possibility of perimeter breach. For a brief moment, Prairieland operated like a forward operating base under siege, an image increasingly familiar in US Homeland Security as extremist incidents grow in complexity and frequency. Outside, the attackers realized the ICE response was not collapsing as they had intended. Their plan to create panic lure officers out of protected positions and overwhelm the center's defenses was failing. Gunfire tapered as they scrambled to retreat. Some fled toward the tree line. Others ran to waiting vehicles idling in the dark. One dropped a bag containing ammunition spray paint and propaganda flyers calling for insurrectionary anarchy material, later cited by investigators as proof of ideological motivation rather than spontaneous violence. As ICE secured the interior command staff coordinated a defensive perimeter, the focus shifted from immediate survival to containment, preventing the attackers from regrouping, re-entering the field, or exploiting any vulnerabilities. Tactical teams armed with protective gear moved to reinforced vantage points, prepared to return controlled fire only if the attackers attempted to breach the compound. This measured approach reflected a broader strategic realization. The attackers' tactics resembled trends outlined by analysts from Jane's Defense Weekly and DW's small extremist factions, adopting techniques common to insurgent groups abroad. Speed, confusion, multi-angle fire, rapid retreat. These are hallmarks of entities seeking to test the resilience of federal security infrastructure. Meanwhile, the response expanded beyond Prairieland. Police dispatchers issued countywide alerts, FBI units mobilized, Border Patrol and DHS operations centers monitored for related signals. Within minutes, a regional law enforcement web formed around the attackers, tightening with each passing moment. But inside the detention facility, as officers held the line and reinforcements approached, a deeper truth emerged. This ambush was not an isolated event. It was a symptom of a rising domestic extremist threat, one increasingly equipped, increasingly ideological, and increasingly willing to strike federal officers at their posts. And as Prairieland's lockdown held firm, the nation was left with a sobering question. If ICE had faltered that night, if discipline had broken under fire, how many lives would have been lost, and what message would that failure have sent to the growing extremist networks watching for their next opportunity? How fast can a regional law enforcement network mobilize when a federal facility comes under coordinated attack? And what happens when extremists who expected to melt back into the dark instead find themselves trapped in a tightening ring of federal, state, and local forces? As the shooters fled Prairieland, the gunfire subsided, but the real pursuit had only just begun. Within minutes of the first 911 call, a chain reaction of alerts rippled across Johnson County. Dispatchers notified every agency in range. Roadblocks went up at key intersections. Patrol cars flooded nearby highways. FBI field units activated emergency response protocols. The attackers, who had counted on confusion and delay, suddenly found themselves running against a rapidly forming multi-agency dragnet. According to early investigative summaries and material recovered at the scene, they had planned for escape, but not for the speed of the coordinated response. As they dispersed into wooded areas and side roads, several dropped equipment while attempting to evade detection. One suspect abandoned a Faraday bag containing blocked electronics evidence of efforts to avoid digital tracking. Others left behind tactical gear, spray paint cans, ammunition, and extremist pamphlets calling for armed revolt against ICE and federal authority. Every discarded piece strengthened investigators' understanding of the attackers' ideology, logistics, and level of planning. Law enforcement units began intercepting suspects within the first 40 minutes. Police stopped vehicles speeding away from the area, each stop revealing more proof that this was no spontaneous riot. Officers recovered AR-style rifles, fully loaded magazines, tactical vests, two-way radios, and professional-grade body armor. One vehicle contained a black and red flag with slogans such as "Resist Fascism," "Fight Oligarchy," reinforcing that the attackers acted with deliberate political intent, not random vandalism. At the same time, FBI agents tracking movement patterns and using thermal imaging from airborne support-monitored wooded routes north and west of the facility. Small groups of suspects believing they could escape on foot were intercepted by patrol units positioned along predicted exit paths. Each arrest yielded additional intelligence, matching propaganda flyers, identical gear configurations, and communication devices tuned to shared frequencies. By the end of the initial pursuit window, nearly the entire group connected to the ambush had been captured or neutralized. According to DHS and DOJ assessments, the operation uncovered 12 sets of body armor and large quantities of materials calling for violent uprising assets far beyond what would be expected from local agitators. The scale of equipment mirrored trends recently highlighted by Rioters and the Guardian extremist groups in the US are increasingly equipped with paramilitary-grade gear and often organized in loosely affiliated cells united by anti-government ideology. While local police secured suspects at traffic stops and rural intersections, federal agents pieced together the broader operational structure. Radios recovered from vehicles were tuned to matching channels. Flyers found in multiple locations advocated identical messages. Even the attackers clothing black tactical outfits with masked faces suggested cohesion, not spontaneity. Their quick scatter and fallback routes indicated pre-planned exfiltration. This multi-agency response became a testament not only to ICE's internal discipline, but to the resilience of America's wider law enforcement ecosystem. When the attackers attempted to fracture into smaller groups, the county-wide containment strategy turned the region into a live operational grid, one that extremists, despite planning, could not outrun. Yet the arrests raised a deeper strategic concern, echoed by DW and BBC analysts. If extremist groups are willing to deploy coordinated fire tactical equipment and escape strategies against federal officers, how many more cells across the country are observing, learning, and preparing for their own escalation? The Prairieland pursuit ended with rapid arrests and overwhelming evidence, but the implications reach far beyond Johnson County. If ambush tactics are becoming the new currency of radical anti-government factions, is America prepared for a future in which such assaults no longer involve a few dozen extremists but potentially hundreds? What does it signify when a second armed attack erupts just 2 days after Prairieland, nearly 400 miles away, targeting yet another federal enforcement site? And how does a nation interpret violence that begins to look less like coincidence and more like ideological escalation spreading across state lines? 48 hours after the Alvarado ambush, violence struck again, this time at a U.S. Border Patrol facility in McAllen, Texas. The pattern was different, but the intent was eerily familiar. A lone assailant wearing a tactical vest armed with an assault rifle opened fire on agents and local officers during what should have been routine operations. The attacker, later identified as 27-year-old Ryan Lewis Mosqueda, moved with purpose, firing multiple shots before officers neutralized him. One police officer was wounded in the exchange. And although Mosqueda had been reported missing earlier in the day by his father, who warned authorities that his son was armed and in psychological distress, the elements surrounding the attack raised immediate suspicion among investigators. His vehicle bore markings, his vest was equipped for sustained engagement, his rifle was fully loaded. Nothing about the moment felt spontaneous, and analysts examining the Prairieland attack were quick to notice parallels. According to early briefings referenced by Reuters and Al Jazeera, DHS investigators assessed that while there was no proof Mosqueda had direct operational ties to the Prairieland cell, the tactical posture and ideological cues suggested possible exposure to similar extremist online spaces, places where anti-ICE and anti-government narratives have intensified throughout 2024 to 2025. The McAllen attack deepened national concerns. If one ambush could be dismissed as an isolated extremist strike, two in rapid succession, both aimed at federal immigration enforcement, raised alarms at DHS, DOJ, and in the Trump administration's national security circles. Border agents already operate under high-threat conditions, frequently facing transnational crime cartel violence and human smuggling pipelines. But an organized ideological threat from within U.S. borders posed a different challenge, one more aligned with the domestic extremism patterns that analysts at DWBBC and The Guardian have documented over recent years. Investigators examining both attacks noted a shared theme: radicalized individuals targeting officers who represent federal authority. In Prairieland, the cell acted with multi-angle fire-coordinated ambush tactics and professional equipment. In McAllen, the attacker operated alone, but employed the same symbolic target: federal law enforcement enforcing immigration law. The consistency suggested a rising willingness among extremist actors, organized or lone wolf, to cross the threshold from rhetoric to armed confrontation. The psychological aspect also drew national attention. Extremist propaganda recovered in Alvarado materials promoting insurrectionary anarchy and urging direct violence embodied the kind of radical messaging that can launch unstable individuals into action. With DHS reporting a dramatic increase in threats and assaults against ICE officers over the past year, the question emerged: are extremist networks deliberately shaping a climate in which individuals like Mosqueda are more likely to attack? Strategic analysts from Defense News and Jane's framed the issue within a broader trend: the blurring line between organized extremist networks and psychologically unstable individuals acting under ideological influence. This hybrid threat complicates federal defense posture. It makes attacks less predictable, more sporadic, and harder to intercept before violence erupts. The McAllen incident also underscored the pressures bearing down on America's border security apparatus. Border Patrol and ICE officers already face mounting operational strain, record migration flows, cartel intelligence operations, and political scrutiny from multiple fronts. A surge in ideologically motivated violence threatens to stretch resources even thinner, forcing agencies to reevaluate staffing readiness and protective infrastructure. But perhaps the most troubling question emerging from the McAllen attack is also the most urgent. If a lone shooter inspired by extremist messaging can replicate the targeting of federal officers only days after a coordinated ambush, how much time remains before another individual or another cell strikes again? As investigators linked the timelines, the geographic distance, and the shared hostility toward federal immigration enforcement, one message became clear: both attacks form part of a wider pattern, one pointing toward a dangerous escalation cycle with national implications. If Prairieland marked the moment extremist violence crossed a line, then McAllen raised the stakes, and it leaves the nation confronting a critical question. With rising ideological hostility and increasingly bold actors, how should federal agencies prepare for a threat that is no longer confined to the shadows? How does a nation respond when extremists escalate from vandalism and protests to coordinated ambushes on federal officers? And what message must the United States send not only to its citizens but to hostile actors abroad when its own law enforcement agencies become targets of ideological warfare? In Washington, the reaction to the Texas attacks was immediate and uncompromising. Federal authorities framed the Prairieland ambush and the McAllen shooting not as isolated outbursts, but as part of a rising tide of anti-government extremism. According to investigative summaries and DHS briefings, assaults on ICE personnel have surged nearly 700% over the past year, a figure consistent with warnings covered by major outlets such as Reuters, BBC, DW, and The Guardian. These attacks, officials argued, demonstrate a shift. Extremists now see immigration enforcement agencies as frontline symbols of federal power and therefore key targets in an ideological war. President Donald Trump's administration moved quickly. The Department of Justice announced a zero-tolerance doctrine for any assault on federal officers, promising maximum federal penalties, including attempted murder conspiracy and firearms charges. Prosecutors began filing cases within hours of the arrest in Johnson County. DHS leadership emphasized that federal officers enforcing immigration law are being targeted because they embody the authority extremists want to destabilize. It was a message intended not only for Americans, but also for foreign governments watching U.S. internal cohesion. Strategic analysts from Defense News and Jane's Defense Weekly underscored the broader implications. Assaults on ICE and Border Patrol are no longer reactive incidents linked to specific enforcement actions. They now appear increasingly organized, ideologically synchronized, and occasionally equipped with paramilitary-grade material. This mirrors global extremist trends observed in Europe and Latin America, where decentralized cells, often connected only through online propaganda networks, shift from demonstrations to direct armed confrontation. The propaganda recovered after the Prairieland ambush was especially alarming. Flyers titled "Organizing for Attack Insurrectionary Anarchy" and slogans like "Fight ICE Terror with Class War" revealed ideological frameworks explicitly advocating assaults on federal authority. The presence of Faraday bags, radios, tactical armor, and pre-planned escape routes indicated that the attackers saw themselves as combatants in a broader conflict. They were prepared for violent surveillance, pursuit, and arrest. They anticipated a firefight. The rounded up suspects also reinforced a growing pattern: small extremist factions with no formal hierarchy, but with synchronized messaging and shared digital spaces, are increasingly capable of executing organized attacks. This network without a structure, as referenced in DW reporting, is difficult to infiltrate because it is decentralized, ideological, and self-replicating. The human toll, however, remains central. A police officer was shot in the neck. Unarmed correctional officers were targeted by gunfire. Agents in McAllen were forced into a life-or-death engagement. Staff members inside Prairieland, cooks, caseworkers, administrative personnel were locked down behind reinforced doors, unsure whether attackers would breach the compound. The psychological impact of such events radiates far beyond the facility walls. Families of officers, local communities, and nearby towns are now forced to confront a new reality. Extremist violence no longer arrives with warnings, it arrives with gunfire. For many Americans, the attacks challenge a core expectation that federal facilities on U.S. soil remain fundamentally secure. When extremists demonstrate the capability to launch multi-angle ambushes on Independence Day, the symbolism is unmistakable. It's a test of readiness, of resolve, of unity. Yet the Prairieland ambush failed. The attackers were captured, the facility held, officers protected their colleagues, and maintained order under fire. McAllen too ended with the threat neutralized. These outcomes carry strategic weight. They signal that while extremists may escalate, law enforcement remains trained, coordinated, and capable of absorbing and defeating violent assaults. But the question now facing the country is no longer how this attack happened, it is what comes next. If extremist networks are sharpening their tactics, expanding their propaganda, and targeting federal authority with increasing boldness, how must America strengthen its defenses, reinforce its unity, and protect the officers who stand on the front line every day? In the months ahead, will federal agencies adapt quickly enough to stop the next coordinated strike before the first muzzle flash lights the dark? The Prairieland ambush in Alvarado, Texas marked one of the most coordinated extremist attacks on a U.S. federal facility in recent years. Under cover of Independence Day, fireworks-armed militants dressed in paramilitary clothing launched a two-direction assault on ICE officers, opening with vandalism and luring tactics before firing AR-style rifles at both a responding police officer and unarmed federal personnel. ICE's disciplined lockdown prevented mass casualties, while a rapid multi-agency pursuit led to the capture of nearly all suspects. Authorities seized rifles, tactical body armor, Faraday gear radios, and propaganda promoting insurrectionary anarchy, confirming the attackers' ideological motivations. 48 hours later, a second assault erupted in McAllen, where a similarly equipped assailant opened fire on Border Patrol agents, reinforcing fears of a broader extremist escalation. Federal officials under President Trump's administration responded with a zero-tolerance policy and heightened security measures. Analysts warn that rising anti-government extremism fueled by decentralized digital networks is driving a new wave of domestic attacks targeting immigration enforcement. Though both Texas attacks were contained, they signal a dangerous shift. Extremists are testing American resilience, raising urgent questions about preparedness for the next assault.